Hi, everyone. I'll give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1114th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Katherine Bradford, Eleanor Gaver, Brook Hsu, Sam Messer, Josh Smith, and Susan Larsen on the event of Jon Serl No Straight Lines at David's Werner Gallery. And now I'll introduce today's guests and host. New York-based artist Katherine Bradford is known for her paintings of people in luminous fields of color. Bradford paints with a formal inventiveness and a shifting sense of figure and ground, giving narrative weight to her characters who may appear as heroes or lovers, families or couples, businessmen or isolated individuals. Eleanor Gaver studied film at NYU, worked for Beth and Scott B., and then moved to LA. Nobody was hiring female directors back then, so Gaver made a biker movie and wrote scripts. Life in the Fast Lane soon got greenlit. At the premiere, when Bach accidentally stabs Taylor in the head and blood spouts everywhere, half the audience ran. Alex Cox, who was sitting next to Gaver, said, "You'll never get a better reaction than that." But Hollywood didn't agree, so Gaver returned to New York to make underground films. Brook Hsu deploys and weaves the autobiographical and the mythopoetic into paintings using an array of materials, including ink, oil paint, industrial carpets, and offcuts of ready-made lumber. The sources for Hsu's imagery come from her own observations, sometimes arising from art history, film, and literature. Artist Sam Messer received a BFA from Cooper Union in 1976 and an MFA from Yale in 1982. Mr. Messer has received awards including a Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation grant, an Engelhardt Award, a Pollock Krasner Foundation grant, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. He most recently collaborated with the poet Sharon Olds on a print project, and past collaborations include working with Paul Auster on The Story of My Typewriter and with Dennis Johnson on Cloud of Chalk. Josh Smith is a New York-based artist who works with painting, drawing, collage, sculpture, printmaking, and artists' books. He first became known in the early 2000s for a series of canvases depicting his own name, a motif that allowed him to experiment freely with abstraction, figuration, and the expressive possibilities of painting. His work has since given way to varied imagery, including grim reapers, leaves, fish, streetscapes, and palm trees that the artist has explored in series. And our host today, Dr. Susan C. Larsen, is an art historian, former curator at the Whitney Museum, critic, and founding director emeritus of the Dorothea and Leo Rabkin Foundation. In 1981, she and her late husband, Laurie Robert Martin, came upon a work by Jon Serl during a chance visit to a downtown emporium in Lake Elsinore, California. Sirl had a local following but was unknown to art audiences outside of California. The couple spent several years documenting and photographing Sirl's oeuvre. A fulfilling friendship ensued, and Susan is completing a memoir titled If We Could Fly of their time and adventures with Sirl based on taped conversations. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Sirl to get us started. Or to Susan to get us started, actually.
Oh, well said, because what I hope to do is to just warm this up by showing you some images of John. When could we start the slides? This we met Jon Serl as you heard in 1981, quite by accident. But we had some knowledge that there were these self-taught artists and who were valuable and wonderful. Our time in New York, we'd already seen some. And when we found John's work, we thought, oh my goodness, here's someone. He was then in his 80s. He was living alone in a really rudimentary home. Um, and this is a photograph that my husband, Laurie Robert Martin, did of John when we tailed him walking through his very favorite place, the swap meet, where he would find spare paintings, panels, all kinds of things that he would then reconfigure and paint on. He was a brilliant person. He was deeply intelligent. He was in many ways very gentle and accepting of other people. His home, this was his home, which was 103 North Scrivener Street, and actually quite in the middle of things in Lake Elsinore. But it was so overgrown, you wouldn't even know there was a house there consisted of a small house and a lot of out sheds. Chickens roamed freely through his home and studio. One day, Sirl said, let's go pick up my laundry. We piled into the car and we went way on the outside of town. You can see in the distance Lake Elsinore and the mountains surrounding it. Jon dried his laundry on top of tumbleweeds and eucalyptus plants, and he was folding it and putting it together. We asked him why he did this. You know, why not use the dryer and the laundromat? He said, I love to smell the earth and the wind and the grass when I fall asleep at night. He lived in an almost late 19th century way, and he had habits and ways of coping with life that were really wonderful to see. They were very instructive and inspiring. Here is Jon with one of his Chihuahua dogs. He had a whole pack of them. They were rejects from a local breeder. She would give him the ones that had defects, and they made a little pack and they ran around his house. The painting in the back is now in the collection of the American Folk Art Museum in New York. My husband and I, Jon did a series of 5 big paintings, and we asked him if he would donate them to the museum. He said, yes, we knew someone on the acquisitions committee, and we created them and sent them to New York, and they were accepted, and they've been part of the museum collection ever since. This is a work called Deep Sea from 1963. It's my opinion that many of Jon's best works are his larger works, that he put a great deal of himself into these larger paintings that he worked on. This theme of swimming, dreaming, maybe the life and death border, the borderline between life and death, is frequent, and it pops up in his work over every single decade of the 5 decades that he worked as an artist. This one is called Man Reading a Book, and I love it because it shows how sophisticated he is. He, much like the much vaunted linguistic theorists of the 20th century, he's looking at language, reading, the written word, drawing, and image making all together in this one seemingly simple work, which very few of his paintings ever contain words, but this is a rare one that does. And I think it's a tell, because you can see how smart he is. And this one is in the collection of the Rabkin Foundation here, where I'm speaking from. It's called Angels Earning Wings. That was the title on the back. These are people going from life to the afterlife, but they're new at it, so they need a boogie board. And it's a small painting, but it's very lovely. It was owned by Dorothea Rabkin. And the couple in the lower right-hand corner are so sweetly in love with one another. And this little boy at the top is being spun out into the universe on his big boogie board, sort of having fun. There is a lot more to know about Jon Serl. His papers exist. Many wonderful paintings are out there. His life story is yet to be told. He was a marvel and a wonder and a joy as a friend, as I'm sure Sam and Eleanor will tell you as well. He was magic. So I think I will ask Sam to tell us about this and also their wonderful show at the Zerner Gallery, No Straight Lines, and tell us about Jon and also about how your show came together.
So I think we should start. Eleanor will start. This is a photo of Eleanor and Jon in patches, who we wound up inheriting after Jon passed. But Eleanor because the show really originated from the genesis of Eleanor. So why don't you start, Elba?
Well, let's see. It was 1989, and I interviewed Howard Finster. And I knew about Finster's Paradise Garden in Georgia. So I was surprised that he was in Beverly Hills on Rodeo Drive. and he was selling cutouts of Marilyn Monroe, which was strange for a visionary painter. And he told me that they were not his idea. And so that got me thinking, what about all the other artists that are considered outsiders? They're outside the art world. They're not working in an artistic community. How are they making art, and how is their art getting to the marketplace? And so I was curious and wanted to find out, and I pitched the idea to Art and Antiques, and they sent a photographer with Sam and I and our two dogs as we drove from Venice, California, across the country, and then all around the Southeast and back. And Jon was the first artist I interviewed. And then when we came back, we stopped to see him again. There's Jon and Sam and Patches. And Jon did not want to be considered an outsider. He, and back then, outsiders, the term included self-taught and folk artists, as well as visionary painters like Howard Finster, and also institutionalized artists like Martin Ramirez. And 30 years ago, Sam promised Jon that he would make sure that he was not considered an outsider. And the show that Sam has curated at Zwirner Uptown, which shows Jon's paintings in conversation with contemporary artists, I think fulfills that promise.
Yes, I think this is a good thing. I'll jump in because with this image of Jon's bedroom, you can see, as Susan talked about, he was very literate. Mm-hmm. He not only was his bedroom filled with books, but he had a separate room that was just books, art books, literature books. And so in these photos that are from the time that Eleanor and I spent with Jon, he was 96 to 99 at this point. And this was a picture Eleanor got Jon. This was the industrial spot when you came off the highway and you first pulled into Lake Elsinore. They had this big American flag, and she brought him over there to and took some pictures of him. So the show was, I remember clearly, Jon took me outside and gave me a painting, and he said, "You need to get my paintings into real museums. Mm-hmm. You need to promise me that people won't forget my work." And I think what Susan talked about, that a lot of his work I would agree with, is this thin realm between living and another world. He, in the very end, when he told me that, he also was telling me that his mother had been visiting him at night, and at night, a lot of his old friends were coming. Like a week, 2 weeks before he passed, we were coming back from breakfast, and he stopped in front of this beautiful chest. Like, people talk about his house. So you could see at this point, when we knew him 10 years later after Susan first showed that picture, the house was totally overgrown from the road. You could not see the house at all. You could hear the chickens and roosters, but you couldn't see the house. But inside, everything was so beautiful and really aesthetic. But so Jon made me, I promised that for Jon. And then I've been trying over the 30 years to make this happen. And it was going to happen, and then it fell apart. But then it happened, and I was talking to Marlena Zwirner because Josh and Dana I wanted in the show. So I was talking to her, and she was just like immediately, "Well, we should do it here." And that's how the show, came to fruition. And myself and Marlena, I wanted to find other artists that I felt would be seamlessly in a show of paintings. Like, if someone really thought about putting a group of painters together that had similar kind of impulses, similar ideas, similar ways of making, and just an urgency and a necessity like Jon did. And so that's how this group how we put this group together. And then now we're getting into some of the images in the show. And maybe, Josh, you could talk about, because after us and Susan, you were the next person to really know about Jon's work.
Yeah, well, I discovered it just looking on the internet, and uh, subsequent times I saw John's work, it began to I began to realize this is an exceptional artist that um, I never knew about. So I started my investigation, and I mean, without really knowing his story, I learned the story somewhat later, and I'm still learning it, probably forever. But I fell in love with his originality and what you all said at the beginning. Um, he wasn't an outsider artist or an untaught artist. I felt like his work had a lot of uh, the freshness and stuff that I wanted to have in my own work, and I fell in love with it. And I was able to buy a few paintings because it it was so overlooked, and and yeah, I was completely blown away and impressed by how fresh his work was. That's
What, could you, Josh, I don't know if you could repeat, you said the other day about you were so kind of inspired by that. John didn't really start painting until he was in his 50s.
right, which I'm getting to be close to 50, and I find that very inspiring because it makes me feel like my back half might be. I mean, I hope and wish that my back half is as explosive and colorful as his his became and was. He was able to carry everything he experienced up until that point and just drop it straight into his paintings, and that's like a miracle. And his energy only seemed to grow. I mean, I don't
Mhm.
grow and multiply. And he found a a for a form of an art form where he could um, drop him drop everything he was carrying inside him straight into it. And I love how bright and colorful his paintings are, and his he didn't get hung up on technical um, things or the precision of rendering a person or the cityscape or the landscape or a group of people. He just dove right into it and trusted his spirit and his accumulating knowledge to make it um, beautiful and wonderful, and he could illuminate any subject that he decided to tackle. He was able to illuminate it with his soul, which is rare and beautiful. And he was a prolific artist. He made
Mhm.
uh, probably hundreds, if not 1,000 paintings,
Mhm.
and uh,
Sure.
and he didn't repeat himself at all. And if he did, if he did, he would grow it in a way that's truly inspiring is such an easy word, but it's illuminating. It taught me a lot about the potential of the human spirit, and it's a shame people, don't aren't around forever. But his paintings hopefully will be around for a long, long time.
And now people are looking at them. And to follow up on that, I think Susan, maybe, John, I think the thing that I hope people get from this today, like hearing the other artists and then eventually, you can go to the website for Zorn and watch the film that Eleanor made, is you will see that there are other ways to be an artist and to make things than the way most of the artists that are coming to this work at first are making or seeing or going through school or being in white boxes. And that John also had friends from all walks of life. At his funeral, Eleanor wrote about The funeral was filled with museum directors, Chihuahua lovers, the Boy Scouts, transvestites, his local friends. He was just open to anyone.
Yep.
And Susan, maybe, and I think you said something about, and then maybe we could go to Catherine, but that Jon, like I said, oh, Jon would have been so happy to be in this space at Werner. And you said, yes, he would, but he also always knew his own worth. And I love that story you mentioned when you first took him to that show that he thought was going to be, that was a big group show. Do you remember that?
Yes, yes. I thought a lot about that this yesterday and this morning. I was thinking my husband Lori and I did a big 250 work omnibus show of West Coast folk and outsider artists that traveled to 4 museums with a catalog. And we borrowed 3 important works from Jon. And it was at the Long Beach Museum. And of course, it was a big, busy place and lots of people going on. And Jon came, a friend brought him. And he walked through the door of the museum. We went to greet him. We took him to his own 3 works that were hanging on the wall looking great. He burst into tears and he wanted to leave because in his mind, he was the only artist that should be in the show. And so, but I think that Jon would love your show because this is a show about his inspirational role with the next generation of artists. And it really is about him. He would understand that. He loved young people. That ramshackle house he had several rooms where kids would just, if they were having trouble at home, they could stay at Jon's. He loved artists to come and people to come, and he did have friends from all walks of life. And one other thing I wanted to say, when you look back at the careers of many of the discovered outsiders, often they became involved with a kind of semi-commercial situation where they ended up replicating and painting the same kind of painting over and over and over again because that did well in the marketplace. That never happened to Searle. He was so fiercely independent and in California and in such a remote situation that till the day he died, he was only painting according to his own lights. He had nobody standing over him or looking over his shoulder. So what Josh just said, so very nicely and so eloquently, is you sense that independence and originality in every single thing you see. And he defended himself against fame and market interest.
Catherine, maybe you could jump in.
Well, I'm really pleased to be a part of this show. That's my painting on the far left there. Runaway wife shelters her house. At first, I wasn't sure if I belonged in this group, and I feel badly that this house has straight lines. But
Totally straight.
They let it in anyway. And there's the runaway wife curving over, sheltering her house. But as people started writing about the show, I felt even more pleased. For instance, Sam Messer wrote that this was a group of artists that trusted their subconscious to find an image. Mm-hmm. At first, I thought he had written dared to go to their subconscious to find an image. But then when I went back and looked, he'd actually said trusted. And once these artists have found an image, then they go to the business of developing it, correcting it, and furthering it, which is exactly the way I work. Alexi Worth wrote that all the artists in the show were, I thought he'd said loose-handed, but he actually said free-handed, which I also love being a part of. I think this refers to the way the paint is put on, the touch. And I value that very much. I also relate to words that Josh was using, especially urgency, necessity, freshness.
Another thing you have in common with Jon Serl is the wonderful way you've explored the human condition and human relationships with a great deal of empathy and irony thrown in.
Thank you, Susan. Yes, I started out as an abstract painter, and eventually I started to include people, but with the knowledge of abstraction, I basically love shapes and color next to color. And I often make my decisions when I'm making a painting the way an abstract painter might. But I love that Sam put this painting next to one of Jon Serl's paintings, which appears to also be about a mother. Is it possible to see that? Yeah, the painting is of this large woman in a white kind of
Oh, that's a different one.
dress, and she seems to be hovering over a smaller child with a doll. So Sam picked right up on the sheltering aspect of motherhood, and maybe the body language of both the figures that we use, this mother and the mother I was using, which I really appreciated. The conversation between this painting and my painting.
Yeah,
Even
that.
they were given a lot of room in this show. That was nice.
Yeah.
Very generously installed.
And Marlena had a lot to do with that. She was very good at that. You know, and Catherine, you mentioned about like finding like the content and then working. So John once said, I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something like, once the art is made, that's when the artist steps in. And I thought maybe this would be a good time, Chloe. Maybe you could play that clip of Brooke, and then Brooke could talk a little bit about her ideas about John and storytelling.
This is Dana Schutz, by the way.
Artists like John, I feel like it must have been that too.
Drama. Always in something, you want to add a little drama. You look at all my pictures, the arms, the feet, even the toes at times. It's you want to thumb your nose at the public. You do it by those little tricks in between.
I think.
Yeah, I thought it was a different clip of John where he just talked about, where Brooke talked about story making, but Brooke, maybe you can just jump in, and because I thought
Sure.
about that was so beautiful.
I think in the clip, like, well, I learned about John's work through you, Sam, because you were my mentor. I met you at Norfolk in 2009, and you know, I didn't see John's work until later when I was working at the Strand and I saw this book come in, One Man by Himself, saw your name across it, and I was like, holy shit, Sam. And then I learned more about Jon Serl through that. And but Sam you've always been like a big, well, maybe to go off Josh's word, like a very illuminating figure in my life, and pointed me in the directions that I maybe couldn't see at the time when I was a lot younger. So I feel like just knowing your connection to Jon, that those teachings that you received from him were passed on to me as well. And like the first time I saw one of your big typewriter paintings, it was a pretty profound experience for me. There was so much like movement and animation in it that I'd never seen before. And now, like seeing more of Jon's paintings, I feel that kind of animation is really present. There's a dance happening in all of the paintings, which is a paradox for painting because they're still, but they evoke emotion through, I'd like to say, dance. And in the video, when we were talking about Jon, I thought that maybe he might have felt similarly as I do, is that painting is a place of liberation. That I've never wanted a doctrine. Like I've never been one for rules, which is contrary to being a painter because there are a lot of restrictions. But I've always felt a freedom in it to express my beliefs. And I see that in his work too. And that the stories that we're able to tell through painting, like painting helps us to tell stories, I feel, and that stories are one of the most valuable things that we pass as human beings. I've started to feel that more and more lately. That just sitting around with people and hearing their stories is actually one of my favorite things. And images are such a great way of helping to do that. So I hung two paintings close together to speak about this slow animation of a repeated form, which is actually something that I've, as I've thought more about it, I feel like having seen Josh's work over the years, especially the emo jungle show, that was a pretty profound experience for me as a young artist, and the repetition and the freedom that I felt in it inspired me to have the confidence and being okay with also painting the same image again, to not like give up on it or something. I don't really know how to articulate it, but yeah.
Yeah, you get swept up in what you're doing, and it becomes like an immersive experience.
This is a very unusual show, you know. This is more the kind of show that a museum does. You know, mostly you go to galleries and you see, you know, the latest work of somebody altogether. But the complicated interface that you created here between, you know, living artists and Jon is really worth studying. I'm glad you have good documentation of it.
Yeah, it's like this is a painting of Dana Schutz. And I just think, you know, going back to the way Josh and some of the people were talking, Catherine was talking about the hanging. So what I think's so in tune between Dana and Jon is the way that the figures always touch the ground or almost touch the ground. And you have, so if we could go from this man driving into the sunset, right, who has skeleton legs, which is like Brook. No, go the other way to the Elvis Presley painting that was on the wall, like this one on the right of it. Yeah, to that one. I think, you know, you can let's see where it's. To me, it looks like Elvis Presley, and I saw it's from 1962. But I just love the way that the figures are both, they're touching, but they're dancing. And John was a dancer. He gave dance lessons. He had been, I guess, doing that. When he did that, he went by the name of Slats.
Mhm.
Well, it doesn't matter. But maybe, there was another painting in that room that had four figures, Chloe, next to each other. And it was a big painting, and it was like four figures to the right of the Elvis. And you showed it before. And it was like, that would be the other way, I think. Oh, maybe not. Yeah, no, keep going. No, not that one. Not that one. So it's all the way at the other end.
Is it once there were four? Is that the one you're after?
No, it was one of John's last paintings because it was on his easel when he died. And I saw it earlier. Keep going. I'm looking. Keep going. That one right there. So you can see it straight on. And they're four figures. It's like two women, and one has one of their hands and the other one's. And I think Katherine pointed this out to me, if I'm not mistaken. Or someone was saying, I thought at first maybe it was a pickpocket, but then I realized it looks more like they're like sharing a muff, or in their pockets to be close or to be warm. And then you have these two men who are walking, down for lawn. And I just think it's a really beautiful painting of John's, and like as Brooke was saying, or Josh was saying, about being human and just like having these small ways of telling so much in the posing. I remember there had been a show at the photography center years ago about coding in photography in the early 1800s, late 1800s. And like with Whitman was in it, and how people would put their hand on a shoulder would mean one thing or another. And I just think that when you go through the show and you look at these, or you look at the other one in the hall there, that big one, the way that figures are interacting with each other and then not is so kind of profound. And and Lewis, if we could get to Lewis's painting, I think you see that too, and which is why Lewis was in the show. And I'll just say I was really glad, Brooke, you talked about that little bit about storytelling, because that's why I wanted you in the show, was because I think you have this kind of poetic narrative that people will understand, but they could never really say what is kind of just the way I think about you. Yeah, so like this, and I think Eleanor was pointing out how it's like, the figures on the left seem to be in a whole other realm, going back to Susan's idea of a different world. And then these two middle figures, I can't tell if this guy is like grabbing this woman's boob, and then these women are talking about it and they're horrified, but there's so much to be interpreted in his film, in his paintings.
If we had his whole body of work all together, and my husband and I made slides of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds in the early 80s, we'd see a lot of exploration of gender, especially women. And he saw women, he loved being around women, but he didn't want to be with a woman. Mm-hmm. And he saw women as very powerful, but also a little frightening. And you see that in that painting.
I love this grouping, which is one of my paintings on the left, John's maybe a self-portrait, and then Louis Fertino's painting, and just the use of those light bulbs or balls, and how John, they come up so often throughout his paintings. Mm-hmm. And I think, and Louis is, I don't know if we can get a closer view of Lewis's and mine, but you can see, particularly in Lewis's, that kind of like really kind of personal, tender narrative. And also, unlike John, he wasn't like hiding anything, right? He wasn't hiding his relationships, which John might have been, might not have. I don't, Mm-hmm. The closest, I'll say this, that John ever talked about sexuality. Well, he talked twice to me about sexuality. Once, one of my friend Dennis Johnson, the writer, and we were at that same diner where in the movie where River Phoenix, and for some reason they started talking about the first time they had intercourse and sex, and they were talking about being in a church, and so they were talking about sex and spirituality. It was really quite amazing because at that point John was 98. But then in his last year, we were in that same diner, and John was reading from a newspaper and started yelling something about Ronald Reagan, who he knew from the movies. And Reagan was the president at the time, or maybe he had just been the president. And he looked up at me and said, there were no homosexuals in my day. And I was like, John, what are you talking about? And he said, no, there were no homosexuals because to be a homosexual means you have to be proud and happy of who you are. So there were no homosexuals in my day. He said there were Marys, but there were no homosexuals. And then we just, talked about something else.
Mm-hmm.
This was an old portrait. This was one of the portraits I made of John. So when I would visit him, I would typically get there. He was back asleep. He would be up all night painting, and I'd get there about 6:30 in the morning, 7 in the morning. And we would go outside or in the house and we'd make a painting. And then he'd be like, should we go? Have you eaten? And of course we hadn't. So we would go eat, and then we'd come back and do a couple of things or do some chores around the house. And then I would drive back to LA.
Which was a long drive.
It was only about an hour and a half. This rooster, I know Josh wanted me to speak. Andy Robert put this rooster in, this chicken or rooster. And there's a sculpture of Josh's, which maybe you could find that we could show. And besides the fact that John lived with roosters and chickens, and, they literally were everywhere. You had to look before you sat down not to sit on an egg. But John considered himself the hawk or the eagle of Elsinore. And when he died, he had tried to make me promise to put I kind of did promise, but to put an eagle's in his coffin with him, which I didn't, but I did have a hawk's skull, which we did put in the coffin for him.
One time we were at the swap meet with John, and there was a man selling chicks, little chickens, like that people would buy and grow up. And we looked in the box, and it was kind of, there weren't many left. There were 3, I think, and 2 of them looked really sickly, and one looked really sickly, and they were 50 cents a piece. And John said he reached down in the box, he picked up the sickly one and put it in his shirt pocket. And he went and picked up the next sick one and put it in the other shirt pocket. And the man said to him, no. He said, you can have those for free. They're not going to make it. And John whipped out $1 and said, if they're worth having, they're worth paying for. He said, just you wait. And months later, the worst one that was going to die was this big, magnificent rooster with a big red comb. So John had a real sense of rescue and hanging on to life.
Well, you can really see it in his paintings. I don't think everyone he paints animals so well. Like, even if they're in this sort of anthropomorphized way, I find that is almost like one of the best ways for us to then project an understanding onto the animal, and to incorporate the animal into our own way of being, like the chicken painting on the far right. I find this painting is so fun to look at, and then simultaneously it's got like a darkness about it, a dark humor that activates a way of thinking in me that I start to imagine. I don't know, I start to tell my own chicken stories in my head looking at those paintings.
He didn't discriminate much between what people consider animals and humans, and even monsters. Everybody got the same treatment.
Yeah.
And I don't think it can be. I mean, if either Susan or Sam wants to talk about it, like underemphasized how much of a life he lived prior to kind of settling down and living a more studio type of life, where he he could have died in the 50s and his life would have been the life of a giant. Like he went from uh, in field to field and interest to interest and met so many and got to experience like it and uh, like almost an incomprehensible richness of places and people, and there were dark times and probably like brighter times. And I think that the dancing thing kind of goes throughout his life into the painting and stuff that was mentioned. But uh, what were some of the roles and the jobs that he had prior to becoming a painter?
Well, I'll jump in with some of the stories that he told me, and then Susan, you probably have many more. Well, I'll start with he remembered being born. And not only did he remember being born, but he said that he remembered being in the womb and all of a sudden the walls were caving in and he thought he was going to die and then he was born. And so he said, now I'm looking forward to seeing what's next. But then he told me, he remembered the earthquake in San Francisco in 1906. He talked a lot about, he had been a fire ranger in Canada.
Mhm.
Butcher. He had, he told me he was born in Orleans, I think, New York, and went across country, covered wagon with his
Sisters.
he said something, maybe Susan knows more, but that then he mentioned step parents, which I don't know about. But then the parts that I know, Josh, were then he talked about, he had been Howard Hughes's gardener. Then he lived in the mission in San Juan Capistrano,
Mhm.
at an outbuilding, which is where he said he started painting because he went to buy a painting and they wanted like $50 for it. So he said, screw that. And he made his first painting. But at the time, and this goes back to what Susan said, that he would let like kids that were having trouble stay with him. He said that the nuns eventually kicked him out because he would let women on their way to and from Mexico having abortions stay there with him. He also claimed that he was the person that fed the swallows in San Juan Capistrano, which it's famous for them stopping there. So he takes credit for that. Then in Hollywood, he was a voiceover. I think he said he had been in the movie Up the River with Humphrey Bogart. He said that he was an extra and that he left Hollywood because of the way they were treating a horse on one of the movie sets. And then I knew him as a painter. So Susan, maybe you know more.
He mentioned, I have to get a videotape of it and really look, but he mentioned being an extra in Lust for Life, which I thought was kind of fun and apropos. He spent a lot of the time as a gardener in Laguna Beach, where people have very fancy gardens. And during the time we knew him, he had a lot of fancy friends in Laguna. Some would come by, and actually I went to a meeting at the house of one of them that we were trying to figure out a will for Jon Serl. That was a farce. That was fun and strange and funny. He, I think when he was at the Mission San Juan Capistrano, he dressed as a priest and in a long black robe. And he did take in a lot of strays. And in some of my audio tapes, he talks about the 60s and about young people in the 60s and being kind of swept away by the vision of a new America that was going to be free and fair for everybody. And then he got really disillusioned. He said that they were all great and they were such fun to be with, but none of them wanted to work very hard. And that's one thing about Sirl. He was a worker. He talked about by dawn's early light that he got up and started painting and painted until the light faded. He admired hard work and forthrightness and a sense of dogged determination. And he really lived in a world of his own making. When you think about it, he kept adding onto that house. He kept filling it with paintings. Everything around him was something he put there. I never saw him live with someone else. Humanity flowed freely through that house, but he was a fiercely independent person, kept his own counsel. He shared so much with all of us so freely, but there are still a lot of mysteries there.
I think Josh, it's also important and I think like Eleanor's film is really important for like younger artists to watch to see how someone could be. But Jon was, as much as he was on his own, he did say to me once, so that painting that's up now, the one on the left, Jon said was his first professional painting. And we traded for that. I had a show in 1992 in Boston with some of my portraits of Jon, and I borrowed. So we put that painting in, and he made another one. He made a portrait of Eleanor with red lips. And he called her Red Lips because he said all journalists had red lips and black clothes. So he was used to like people coming, and he loved that, people coming and interviewing him. He knew Hedda Hopper, who was like the big gossip columnist, I think in the 40s. Mm-hmm. But also, Eleanor was friends with Donna O'Neill. The O'Neills were the second largest landowners in California. Mm-hmm. And there was a roundup, and I was meeting Eleanor at the roundup at their place near Camp Pendleton. And it's just over the mountains where Jon was. And I drove there, and I knew Donna was a big art collector. Like she had all the LA artists, early collector Philip Guston. And I took her to the car and I said, oh, look at this portrait I made of this guy. And she looked at it and said, that's Jerry Palmer. Mm-hmm. Jerry? She said, he introduced me to the love of my life, Ed Moses. Mm-hmm. So, Jon knew the LA artists, and they knew Jon. They wouldn't hang out or see each other, but he was, he wasn't connected. And like Rousseau knew Picasso. Rousseau was in the world of Paris at the time, but really made his own way. Jon once said, one man by himself, I like it that way. I want to be, he found his own way.
They were considering including Jon in the great big show on the spiritual and art at the LA County Art Museum. And Maurice Tuckman and his assistant went to interview Jon. And I heard the assistant went into Jon's house and came running out and said, no, we're not going in there. And so he wasn't included in it. But when the show happened, they invited me to give a lecture at one of the lecture series. And so I decided I gave a lecture on Jon Serl.
I also, he had a room full of books. And like I said, so many people would come and visit Jon because people knew him. And there was a picture of Tom Waits, and he had it just with the books. And I was like, Jon, why do you have a picture of this guy here? And he goes, that guy? I always have to throw him out. He always comes here and he's always drunk, and I have to tell him to leave. So, and I've been I'm saying that because I'm hoping someone will tell Tom that the show is up, because there were so many people that crossed his life and also within those other jobs. I don't know what all the young jobs, there's a really beautiful painting of Jon's where it looks like he is in a dress, that he was like maybe a female impersonator in vaudeville when he was young.
Yes, he was, especially as a child. Yes. Mm. He said
was the thing he told me about, and I took him once to an apple field, and he wanted to pick apples again because he talked about, and Chaz Garabedian and Ed Moses talked about that too in the 30s. They would go off into the fields and steal and kind of oranges and apples because during the Depression, there was no food. And then he spent so much time, he would go pick his apples, or go growing food.
I was given a set of answering machine tapes. I think I shared them with you, Sam, of Jon's talking, and you could really hear the reticence. It was hard to always figure out what was going on, but it was usually somebody wanting something from him. And these were art people who their energy was so clearly of the art world type of person who just wants something. And you could hear Jon trying to be nice and polite, but also trying to distance himself from that energy in order to preserve what he was trying to get accomplished and grow in his studio. He had a real like inherent reticence to engage with the type of aggressive desire of what he was doing. He seemed to understand it was, destructive for what he was doing was a delicate thing, and there was a certain. I don't think he let anybody in. The fact that he said he would throw someone at, and that he let Sam and Susan become close to him. He was cultivating a richness and trying. I think he was aware. He managed to stay incorruptible, which is a really tough thing to do if you're a good artist.
Yeah,
One of the
I think Chloe wants to end, but before that, Charles, I just wanted to say to be aware of that. John once said to me when he was tired, because I would make him pose when he was almost 100. And I said, I'm sorry to do this. He said, no, I like doing this because I know that someday I'm going to be even more famous because of your portraits of me. And the other thing he said that speaks to what you said is he said, anyone can make a Jon Serl. All you have to do is rip yourself apart and put yourself back together again.
I think one of the most poignant aspects of this show is the premise, which is Sam having promised Jon Serl when he was dying that he would not let people forget him and his work. And thus this, as Susan pointed out, very elegant show at David's Warner. And there was a comment on social media, damn, Jon Serl would be really pleased with this show in such a swishy place. I think it all worked out beautifully, Sam.
Thank you, Kat.
And I congratulate both you and Susan and Marlena. Everyone.
All of you. Thank you for lending your wonderful work to the show. It's an homage of a kind that most artists never ever have.
Chloe,
Hopefully there'll be more.
Yeah.
So we're going to ask a few questions from the audience, and then we'll show a video clip to conclude today. There's a form in the chat where you can submit your questions for today's speakers, and I encourage the audience to submit questions there, and I will either ask the question on your behalf or turn over the mic to you. Sam, someone in the audience who chose to remain anonymous is wondering if there are any future Jon Serl exhibitions coming up that you can tell us about.
I have no idea. I would think that this show will generate that, but I don't know. I would think that people, anyone with eyes and a heart, would look at this show and want to do more. I also think that the show we put on could go on the road, just like John used to do shows. Like we should. It's like it could travel to like the other. It could be in institutions, but there is nothing that I know of.
It seems inevitable, though.
There will be. There will be.
I'm going to ask briefly what it was like for you to curate the show, Sam, and what it illuminated for you about John's work that maybe you didn't know before you made the show.
Well, it just made me crystallize more of how I knew when I would be talking to John in his studio, he reminded me of my friend and my first teacher, Jake Berteau. I could close my eyes and I could be talking to any number of artists that I knew, and there was no difference. And so, but what I've noticed in curating the show and then putting it in relationship to some of the other paintings, like particularly anyone goes into the show, if you look at Josh's painting, the beautiful painting of the palm trees, and then if you go to the other end of the wall and there's a little still life, and that still life has also these weeping flowers. And you can see how time, like Josh does that thing, you do speak about death a lot in your paintings, but death is about time. And that painting of John's is all about time. It's those flowers wilting. There's a candle melting. And Josh, you did say he wasn't the thing about technical, but in some ways he was, because like he talked to me about, I had the best red. He couldn't find a good red paint. Like he really knew what he wanted. But in that painting, there's one candle. It's very beautifully thinly painted, and one candle where the wax would be melting, he actually built the paint up. It's kind of literal, but it really works. So those kinds of details. And really what I noticed because of the show, like in Catherine's painting, with the way that that mother touches the ground and the way that Dana's feet touch the ground. And then I put in my typewriter painting, there's that light, which I really was thinking about the ball in his self-portrait, is how those little details in that first clip that we saw, where John talked about you can get so much expression in the fingers or in a hand. And John and I talked about Goya. I remember talking to him about my favorite painting was the black painting of two people eating soup. And so, he really understood and everyone did, but I saw it even more, like that woman slipping her hand into the other one's pocket, the way people would touch, the way things would be presented just became, I just saw more and more just how thoughtful and how actually smart he was as a painter. I mean, visually, he was so smart. And last thing I'll say is I showed some paintings to someone who's a dancer, and she just looked at it and said, well, this guy clearly knows choreography. This guy was clearly a dancer.
Mhm.
Thank you, Sam, for that answer. We have another anonymous question. Someone is wondering if John made other work in other mediums besides painting.
Not that I know of.
He made some sculptures, and he did do. Sam shared with me he has one, a concrete sculpture of one of his figures. It's quite something, and I've seen drawings, but not too many. Like a lot of the drawings became paintings, but I have seen some. But he never had a chance to do prints or
Like,
anything like that. Oh yeah, there's a sculpture.
He had sculptures like that through his garden
yeah, that was,
and affixed to the house.
I took that when he died and brought it home. Now it's in my backyard.
Oh, uh-huh. Yeah.
All right. Well, our last question today is going to be from Fong. Fong, I'll give you the chance to ask.
Thank you. Thank you for an exciting conversation, you all. This is so great. Sam, congrats for having done this amazing put together group show and such an incredible group of artists participating in it. And just so lucky that Susan happened to know, my old friend Susan, happened to know Jon Serl too. So I was happy to put you in touch with her, Sam. Yeah, I have one question. As I've been exposed to his work just before knowing Sam, but then gotten through a more relatively close look at the works, and I was thinking it's such a rich repertoire of his painterly approach to imagery, which is very hard to articulate and distinguish from certain other visionary self-taught artists we know, I mean, just to look at Kathy's work, her painterly touch, which is dry. She loves using crumble old brushes to get that, incredible sense of touch to the edges versus Josh fluidity of wet paint. And then there's such a control, monochromatic orchestration of color in Brook's work, as opposed to more slowly moving in making imagery in Dana's work too, So how do we put in contact with other self-taught visionary or outsider artists like Forrest Bass, Forrest Bass only paint when he have a dream. We know that, and his painting is constant, remaining relatively small. And it seemed to be very consistent in the way that he emphatically lay on the paint. on, on the canvas, as opposed to all the, mentally ill artists like Wolfley or whoever else in that, so-called art brut group in Europe, to whom everything that had to do with repetition is a form of reliance on their own safety, because the world is so chaotic. So they have to create a certain alphabet, certain artistic renovation, innovation that ensure their own self-assurance, So I wonder if you can sort of think about that for a minute.
Yeah,
I mean, you love his works, John, for different reasons. But to me, it's amazing that he has such an amazing repertoire of that
I,
painterly invention.
I think, Fang, what you're saying is so in a way disheartening, because the whole point of the show is to not have that conversation. Because to me,
Okay.
John, is not
Right.
in that world. And I think what this show makes clear, he's so much more interesting than those, than the guy in Chicago, Bill Traylor, right? Bill Traylor's work was incredibly amazing. It's all the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the people you talk about, and this is why, I don't want to have the conversation about John and these visionary artists, because he wasn't that.
Yeah.
There's like, if we go to a show of anyone else in this show, we're not going to bring up Wolfley and those people because there's no reason to. And there's no reason to with John, except that he had an eccentric life.
Mm-hmm.
But so did Goya. So did Rubens. So did actually Raphael. Was it Raphael who died of bloodletting, right? Because he stayed out all night. So I that's the whole point of the show is he is not that kind of artist. Those are visionary artists where they have a vision, they make it. And those people, it's usually very consistent. It's either in everyone is extraordinary or they're kind of all bad, and that's a kind of world.
It was never knowing Jon Serl in my life. It was one of the most liberating and thrilling experiences. He gave you courage. He made you feel that you could dance through life, that you were free. He was like a wild creature. He was free because he lived on his own, and he made sure that he could find in the world what he needed. He didn't need anything from someone else. He made all of us freer, happier, better.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the opposite in many ways. He didn't cling to art out of a need for safety. He shared his freedom through his paintings.
I think that's like also if you look at the like the growth more chronologically in the paintings. I think in the video Sam hangs some up and talks about the evolution of forms throughout John's paintings as he continued to paint for so many decades. There's this change, a slow change that happens, and the forms reflect this kind of freedom. I think that was so special to John, is what it sounds like from the people who had the privilege of knowing him.
When we would spend time with John, then we'd turn around and go back to our university jobs. And nothing could have been a bigger contrast than that. It was like going to a national park or something. It just made you feel that the world was a big place and you were free in it.
Yeah, I mean, it's in his Wikipedia page. Somebody had to change that.
Yes, it's a very bad Wikipedia page.
Wikipedia,
it's terrible.
Mention him in the same light as Grandma Moses and Hicks. Somebody had to remedy that. Have to change.
Yes,
but I don't know what it is that one of my favorite philosophers, Soren Kierkegaard, once say, "Once you label me, you negate me."
Mm-hmm.
There's something detrimental because we actually, Kathy and I, were at a small birthday dinner for Christmas on last night, and Kathy arrived to her maturity relatively late, and we were talking about the notion of being free from something and to becoming free to something. And how do you stay elusive to people who want to pigeonhole you, So it's it's very inspiring to see the show and you put together, Sam. And yeah, I do not want to pigeonhole either. For the real, have no mission statement, so I follow my crazy artist friend who stay elusive from all being defined and labeled. So for that, I'm grateful to you guys. Yeah, let's go see a show again.
Yeah.
And those
One
of
more
you who
week,
haven't seen it.
Saturday, anyone can come from 3 to 6. We're going to sit around and draw. We're going to provide pencil and paper, and we can talk and tell stories and draw.
Cool.
That's great. Well, thank you, you guys. Back to you, Chloe.
Thank you, Fong. We've had a waterfall of questions come in while you all have been speaking. So I'm going to ask one more, and then we'll show the clip from Eleanor's amazing film. This is a question from Mark Barker. The show offers Sirl's work in the company of other artists. Did his home contain works by other artists that kept him company in his life?
Not that I ever saw.
He had art books, but I don't know if saw anyone else's work.
Nope. It's just dissolving into tears when we put him in a group show.
I think it's useful to just take away the whole idea of outliers and stuff for all artists, because it doesn't help me as an artist to think like that. I like the two-dimensional surface and what these different souls over time have used it for. I regardless of someone's predicament or mental state or whatever, I think it's useful to just disregard that and focus on what amazing things people have accomplished. And that's the way I think.
Yes, I agree with that.
Maybe too.
Thank you all so much. And thank you everyone in the audience for your questions today. I apologize if we weren't able to get to your question. We had a lot come through. And thank you again to today's speakers. We're going to close today with a clip from the film on Jon Serl by Eleanor Gaver, which is available on David Werner's website. And I encourage everyone to watch the film after this. But I'm going to share a clip for us to end on. Here we go.
You see how the impossible can become possible.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Katherine. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Brooke. Thank you, Josh. Thank you to Haley and the team at David Werner who helped prepare all of those beautiful images of the show that we looked at together today. The rest of the images were from Susan and Sam's personal archives, and it was really beautiful to be able to show those. So thank you, Susan and Sam, for sharing those, and to Eleanor as well for sharing some of the clips from the film. Thank you to the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making conversations like this one possible. They also support our archive, where you'll be able to watch this shortly on our YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. We're currently raising $200,000 in support of our work. We encourage you to support our work and donate to the Rail and to our staff and our operations at the link in the chat. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with Neil Yalter and Ovul O. Dumoshawu and Jill H. Cassid on the occasion of Nil's Lifetime Achievement Award and exhibition at the Venice Biennale, as well as a recent exhibition in London. And as is Rail tradition, you all can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so, so much for joining us today. And we hope to see you again soon in the NSE.
Thank you. Talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Sam.
Thank you,
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Susan.
much
Thank
for
you.
moving this conversation.
Thank you, Brooke.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Go see the show, Jubilee. Go see the show, please. Great show. Thank you, you guys. Thank you, Susan.
I'm on Saturday.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Brooke.
Thing.
See you
Yes, indeed.
Saturday. Long live Jon Serl.
Yeah, long live.
Long live.